Hello, my name is Satoko Norimatsu, one of the co-coordinators of the International Network of Museums for Peace. I'm honored to be part of the panel to discuss roles of the Museums for Peace in a Peace and Justice Studies Association conference of 2021. This year, like every other year, the Japanese Prime Minister hosted the annual national ceremony for the war dead at Nippon Budokan Building, adjacent to the Imperial Palace and Yasukuni Shrine. The event takes place on August 15th, the day most Japanese remember as the end of the war day. At the ceremony, Prime Minister Suga said, "In the last war, more than 3 million of our brothers and sisters lost their lives. This is a typical and representative of the mainstream Japanese understanding of Imperial Japan's war. Although experts estimate that approximately 20 million people were killed, if not more, in the Pacific theater of the World War II, only 3 million deaths are recognized in the Japanese government's official ceremony to remember the war dead, meaning Japanese deaths only." At the ceremony, Emperor Naruhito said, "While remembering the long peaceful years since the end of the war, we look back on the past and based on deep remorse, we sincerely hope that horrors of war will never be repeated." Neither Suga nor Naruhito specify which war or wars they are referring to by saying the last war or the end of the war. There seems to be a consensus in Japan that the war ended on August 15, 1945, but people don't talk about the start of the war. The war memory is primarily what Japan suffered in the last stage of the war: loss of family members, aerial bombings, atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, food shortage, evacuation, and so on. When I give talks to Japanese audiences and ask them what the last war refers to, most people say that it's a war that started on December 8, 1941, and they mostly believe that the Japanese started the war and ended the war with the United States only. But in fact, the Japanese attack on the British Malaya was even earlier than the Pearl Harbor attack, and Japan attacked Singapore, Hong Kong, Guam, the Philippines, and other places on the same day. Japan waged a war against the Western colonial powers that were controlling much of the Southeast Asia and the Pacific, where Japan wanted access to oil, minerals, food, and human resources in order to continue the ongoing war in China. Some people in Japan call the war the 15-Year War, referring to the Japanese war of aggression against China, which started with the invasion of Manchuria on September 18, 1931, which turned into a full-scale war at the Marco Polo Bridge on July 7, 1937, and continued until the Japanese defeat in August 1945. Some historians and journalists go further, citing the First Sino-Japan War as Imperial Japan's first full-scale war of aggression overseas, calling the period of 1894 to 1945 as a 50-year war. Others argue that the Japan's imperial quest started in the 1870s in the wake of the country's modernization. In fact, Japan's annexation of then independent kingdom of Ryukyus occurred in a period, and the first use of military threat by modern Japan against Korea and Taiwan occurred in a period as well. Whatever the definition of the last war is, I believe it is important for people in Japan to learn and know what happened during the 70-plus years of Imperial Japan's colonial history and war atrocities. This list is far from exhaustive. When I teach, speak, and write on peace and justice in Asia, I focus on these events because these things happened and young people in Japan and elsewhere are entitled to this knowledge so that they can build a better future. However, Japan's political situation for the last decade, especially under the far-right Abe government, has made it particularly difficult to talk about and teach this history. The tendency of Japanese war memory focusing on what Japan suffered and neglecting what Japan did to other countries is particularly evident in the Japanese notion of the only A-bombed nation in the world, which is used across the broad political spectrum, and it is a symbol of Japan looking at itself solely as a victim of the war. That notion of the only A-bomb nation is widely used not just among right-wing nationalists, but among the Hiroshima, Nagasaki peace and anti-nuclear communities without considerations to Korean victims who account for 10% or more of the atomic bomb victims. On October 8th, in his first policy speech at the parliament, new Prime Minister Kishida Fumio said that As a prime minister from the A-bomb city, Hiroshima, I aim for a nuclear weapons-free world. I want to be a bridge between nuclear and non-nuclear states and fulfill the obligation as the only A-bomb nation in wartime. This is the A-bomb nationalism Japan, which ironically manifests at the cenotaph for the atomic bomb victims in the Hiroshima Peace Memorial Park, by which a large tall flagpole with a giant rising sun flag stands. Hiroshima Peace Memorial Museum is no exception, presenting such historical view. The museum, after the renovation of recent years, put much of the historical content into this touchscreen media table, which many visitors do not seem to bother spending time at. Throughout the museum, there's no critical mention of Japan's aggressive wars. It does show that there are Korean A-bomb victims, but they are presented as part of the non-Japanese foreign atomic bomb victims who happen to be in Hiroshima. There's no connection to the Japanese colonial rule of Korea, which was the very reason why so many Koreans were in Hiroshima, not necessarily by choice. In the next slide, I will show you how the touchscreen panel called Hiroshima and Military describes the Hiroshima-based Japanese Army 5th Division's activities outside of Japan. I'll read the description by the museum as I show you. Quote, in 1871, Hiroshima's military history began with the establishment of the first outpost of the Kyushu garrison at Hiroshima Castle. In 1888, when the Imperial Japanese Army was reorganized, the 5th Division was stationed in Hiroshima. A division is a primary strategic unit in the military organization. Units belonging to the 5th Division engaged in modern Japan's major military campaigns: the First Sino-Japanese War, the Russo-Japanese War, the Boxer Rebellion, the First World War, the Siberian Expedition, the Manchurian Incident, the Second Sino-Japanese War, and the Pacific War. In addition, as indicated by the presence of the Army Transport Division and 3 Army depots, the city remained a critical and essential military base until the end of the Second World War. End quote. Hiroshima's 5th Division was a perpetrator in most of the aggressive wars of Imperial Japan, which killed millions of innocent people across the Asian Pacific. But you can feel that with this kind of dry presentation. This is in stark contrast to how the museum emotionally shows the suffering of ordinary people, women, men, and particularly children from the atomic bomb and its effects. But when the museum says that Hiroshima remained a critical and essential military base until the end of the Second World War, they are not exactly accurate. Hiroshima and surrounding areas are still very much a growing war capital, now in conjunction with the United States. As you can see in the map, Hiroshima, which many regard as a sacred space for peace, is surrounded by US Army ammunition depots, Japanese ground self-defense forces bases, and a Iwakuni base, which hosts both US Marine Corps and Japanese maritime self-defense forces. The Iwakuni base houses the first Marine aircraft wing, and in recent years, 60 USS Ronald Reagan carrier-attached aircraft have been moved, making Iwakuni the biggest air base in the Far East. There is also Japanese maritime self-defense force Kure base, which is the home port of Kaga, the helicopter carrier with a plan to be converted into an aircraft carrier. If you ever visit Hiroshima for a peace tour, you should stop by at Kure for a military tour. I was there last year and joined a cruise tour around the Kure military port, and I was shocked to see those imperial rising sun flags that were available for tourists to wave at warships. Hiroshima Peace Museum, whose mandate is to inform the horrors of nuclear weapons and promote peace, says nothing of the massive military buildup happening in its backyard, hand in hand with the biggest nuclear threat of the world. I have briefly illustrated the Japanese mainstream war memory, which is narrow, victimhood-centered, and revolves around the A-bomb nationalism as shown in the notion of the only A-bombed nation, constructed and reinforced by the general lack of knowledge and education on the country's aggressive past. These tendencies manifest in the Hiroshima Peace Memorial Museum, ceremonies and monuments around Hiroshima, largely oblivious of the aggressive nature of the city, not just in the past, but in the present as well, with the US Japan military alliance almost entirely unchallenged in the peace education, peace museums, and peace narratives in general. I would like to explore what roles museums of peace can play and how they can be designed to address these gaps of knowledge and gaps in critical and alternative thinking. Thank you.